This is DeGaris Masculist Mgtow flyers. That is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and Mgtow, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo DeGaris. This is flyer number 454, entitled, "How bitter will the ideological gender wars become?" Description. As men become conscious of the massive gender injustice committed against men in the hated fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts and the decades-lasting man-slavery of fluffy parasites, they will have the intellectual tools to hit back and crush the monoconscious misandry of the fluffy feminists. Since the feminists have had a monopoly of gender politics for nearly 60 years, this hatred coming from the masculins will cause them to retaliate with hysterical passion. This in turn will only increase the hatred level of the masculists against them, since to masculists, the man-slavery of fluffies this century is far worse than the slavery of Negroes of the 19th century, a much greater casus belli, a cause for war. If the fluffy feminists remain monoconscious and do not help men fare the gender laws, especially in the divorce courts, then masculists will eventually kill them. In other words, this flyer predicts that the level of bitterness in the ideological gender wars will be extreme, a war issue. The flyer itself. How bitter will the ideological gender wars become? By Prof. Dr. Hugo DeGaris. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Humanity is currently undergoing a major gender roles paradigm shift, as women now have a career window of half a century, so are pouring into the workforce, and men are now freeing themselves from the traditional man-slave role of working for women for decades of their lives. These are huge shifts that are undermining the deeply unconscious expectations that the two sexes have had of each other. The main cause of this earthquake in gender role expectations was the male invention of the contraceptive pill and other effective contraceptive devices, so that women could control reliably the number of kids they wanted, which was usually 0, 1 or 2. More than that is usually considered too expensive, with American estimates that it costs about $250,000 to raise one kid. This controlled female reproduction was probably the most important social change in history, since it changed everything. The Industrial Revolution and market capitalism caused the breakup of the multi-generational farm family, forcing the need for the formation of the nuclear family of breadwinner father/husband and child raiser mother/wife, who often had a dozen kids to look after, definitely a full-time job. In the 1960s, women were given the contraceptive pill by men, along with household gadgets, science-based medicine, life expectancies well into the 80s, higher education, etc. After World War II, traumatized men wanted emotional stability and pushed for what they had before the war, that is, traditional gender roles, so that women who worked in the war industries were pushed back into the housewife role. And first wave feminism, in brackets, which was largely about obtaining the right to vote for women, close brackets, effectively died out. Women were expected to be nurturing housewives, supportive of men, and dependent on men for their financial upkeep. In the 60s, a gender role revolution occurred. Upper middle class intellectual housewives got bored with being stuck in their home while their 1 or 2 kids were off to school. So began the second wave feminist movement, brackets, thanks to Betty Friedan, with the publication of her book, The Feminine Mystique, which pushed for women to adopt the male lifestyle of having careers. This movement went overboard a bit, overselling the importance of female careerism, since millions of women bought into this new feminist ideology and devoted themselves to their careers at the expense of getting a husband and having kids. As a result, the unhappiest group of people in modern countries are now professional women in their 40s, with no man in their life and no kids. They are miserable, feeling that life has passed them by. They deeply regret not being more traditional. This problem is so extensive, I read now, that in the US, a quarter of women are on anti-depression drugs. The second wave feminists raised their feminist consciousness, lashing out at how men oppress women. For example, rape, sexual harassment, blocking women from equal pay, from equal access to the professions, pushing for fault-free divorce, the abortion right, etc. So that many second-wave feminists learned to hate men as a sex for the awful gender injustices that men committed against women. One only has to read the feminist books of that era to understand why so many women hated men. These second-wave feminists then pushed for changes in the gender laws, for example, equal pay, anti-discrimination in employment, fault-free divorce, the abortion right, the takeover of the divorce courts, relabelling them family courts, etc. Once they had control of the divorce courts, they brought with them their unconscious, unquestioned expectations of men, that is, seeing men as the breadwinner. That is, they gave men, the husband, the father, the same role after the divorce as he had before the divorce, that is, as the principal breadwinner, since after the divorce, with small children, it was unquestioned in these second-wave feminists' minds that the mother would be at home looking after the small children. So who would be earning the living for the family? The father, of course. So these feminists created new laws that forced divorcing fathers to pay both for his kids, who were ripped away from him with a 90% probability, and for his financially parasitic ex-wife. These feminists did not impose demands on the ex-wife to get off her fat parasitic ass and fip up, that is, become a FIP, brackets, financially independent person. So that in practice, a fluffy, in brackets, equals traditional woman who expects to be able to parasite off the money and labour of a man, close brackets, could readily and easily divorce her husband, in brackets, often her many dozenth penis, close brackets, and then sit back and live off his money for the rest of her parasitic life. Women initiate about 70% of divorces. That is, about 2/3 of divorces are started by women. That is, at a rate about twice that of men, or by men. This is not surprising, since the fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts are so favourable to women and utterly callous to men. Most of the divorce courts are run on a daily basis by monoconscious feminists who know nothing about masculine ideas, so by default have traditional expectations of men, who see men as cash machines, put on this earth to pay for women to have babies. These monoconscious feminists inevitably have negative opinions of men, having had only their feminist consciousnesses raised, so are angry at men for the ways that men oppress women, so often feel, with their power of control over the divorce courts, they are able to revenge men for these oppressions, thus committing the error that two wrongs don't make a right. In fact, the monoconscious fluffy feminists who control the divorce courts are committing a massive gender crime against men. They cause a quarter of all fathers to lose their kids. So that's not surprising that young men refuse to marry and have kids, because these fluffy feminists have made divorce so toxic for men that young men reject marriage and paternity, since they absolutely refuse to face a 1 chance in 4 of losing their kids and being forced to pay a fluffy parasite ex-wife for the rest of his life. Specifically, in a Western country divorce court, the divorcing father will lose custody of his kids with a 90% probability. that is, a near certainty. He will lose his house so that his ex-wife can raise her kids in it. He'll be forced to pay her half of his wealth, half his stuff, forced to make child payments to kids he will barely see. And if his ex-wife is a real fluffy, he may be forced to pay her alimony for the rest of his life, with no legal nor moral obligation on her to get off her fat parasitic ass and fip up. She thus remains a parasite after the divorce, the way she was before the divorce. Given the horrors of the above, it's not surprising that in many Western countries now, 2/3 of young men refuse to marry, reject paternity, and live the lifestyle of the Mgtow, brackets, men going their own way, close brackets, spending their money on themselves and not risking having most of it stolen from him by the hated, fluffy feminist hypocrite divorce court system. The toxicity of the fluffy feminist hypocrite-controlled divorce courts, in brackets, hypocrite because these monoconscious feminists want equal rights with men in the parliaments but reject equal obligations with men in sharing out equally the burden of earning the living by bothering to fip up and get a career-competent education at high school and college, close brackets, is the primary reason for the rise and rise of the Mgtow movement. The Mgtows are reacting to the toxicity of the divorce courts, controlled by monoconscious, fluffy feminist hypocrites, who by definition know nothing of men's lib, of Mgtow philosophy and masculism.